Right, hello everybody. This is our next Talking Heads production for the LUNZ Hub Soil Health and Carbon Dynamics Topic Advisory Group that's headed up by my colleague here, Pete Smith from Aberdeen University. I'm Ellen Fay from the Sustainable Soils Alliance, and today we're going to be talking to Richard Bardgett. So I'm going to hand over to Pete for a very quick introduction there.
Yeah, so when we thought about an expert that we needed to talk to about soil biodiversity, there was nobody else to pick but Professor Richard Bardgett from the University of Manchester. So thanks very much for agreeing to talk to us, Richard. And we'll try and ask you some questions that allow you to share your expertise with the wider team. Thank you very much. Over to you, Ellie.
Great. So I'm going to jump straight in with our first burning question for you, Richard, which is how many species live in the soil and what are the most abundant and diverse groups? And then there's a kind of sub-question there that we often get asked and get different sort of statistics for, which is what percentage of the world's biodiversity lives in the soil?
Okay, thanks. And also thanks for asking me to talk about soil biodiversity, which is obviously a topic I always like to speak about. I think how many species actually live in the soil is a really difficult question to answer, largely because we don't actually know. Because some groups of organisms we don't really know much about at all, like viruses, for example. So our knowledge of how many species is relatively vague, I would say. But there was a recent comprehensive analysis done, which suggested that 59% of all species on Earth can be found within the soil. There were various assumptions made in terms of calculating that, but that would suggest that soil is the most speciose habitat on Earth. In terms of the most abundant groups, it's probably, well, not probably, the microorganisms, bacteria and fungi are likely, well, they're the most abundant numerically, but also the most diverse. And something like probably 45 to 50% of all bacterial species on Earth will be found in soil. And for fungi, it's probably more likely about 90%. So they're almost exclusively, the majority of them at least, can be found in the soil. So there's really a vast number. I mean, just to put it into perspective, if you just take a handful of soil from any field or a garden, for example, there's probably 1 billion bacterial cells within that handful, and there could be thousands, if not tens of thousands of individual species of bacteria. I think one thing just to mention as well is that soils are highly complex in their diversity. So we mainly or often talk about the microbes or the more well-known animals like earthworms, but there's a wide range of different types of animals within the soil. There's a real food web of all these different interacting organisms, which is literally vast in its abundance and diversity. So, the headline message, I guess, is that, 59% of the species can be found in soil, making it the most speciose habitat on Earth.
Wow. I mean, it's a really inspiring numbers. People love statistics, don't they? Simple ones. And they really focus your mind, some of those extraordinary.
Yeah, they do.
Yeah. So in terms of enumerating soil biodiversity, what are the big challenges that you run up against?
Well, I think the biggest challenge is getting the animals and the microbes out of the soil in the first place. Soil is very heterogeneous, physically heterogeneous, and it can be quite challenging to get them out to be able to actually count them. And they're out of sight, they're microscopic, so we can't just look at them and count them like plants, for example, or invertebrates. So that makes it very difficult. It's also very time consuming to do that and expensive. Techniques have developed tremendously, particularly molecular tools, which really allow us to sort of interrogate the diversity and get a much fuller picture. But at the moment, they're still quite time consuming. They're still quite expensive. And you also need specific expertise to be able to handle the data. I think the other thing to just mention is that a lot of the animals in particular require very specialist people to actually identify them. I remember when I was younger, I was looking at collembola or springtails in the soil. And I always remember going to a specialist in the Netherlands, and we had little test tubes with individuals of collembola that I thought were all the same species. So there might be 6, 7 different collembola. And I showed them, and every time he looked at them down a microscope, he'd say, there are 6 different species here or more. So, you know, what I thought was the same species actually turned out to be several species. So you need very trained people, and the bottom line is there aren't many of them around who can do that. So I think they're the real sort of challenges. I mean, other challenges are that most microbes can't be cultivated, for example. So we rely on molecular tools increasingly to be able to identify them.
Yeah, so that's got their gobsmacking numbers. So why are there so many species in the soil? What are they all doing?
Well, it's an interesting question, and it's something that people have been puzzling over for many years. They call it the enigma of soil biodiversity. You know, why are there so many species in the soil? And you know, there are various theories on diversity and why species can coexist and the role of disturbance or productivity. But I think what it really boils down to is that soil is just so spatially and temporally heterogeneous. So if you walked across a field, the soils vary tremendously across that field. They'll vary with depth. And as a result, it really gives these organisms like an unrivaled opportunity for specializing in different niches. And if they specialize, you can allow species coexistence. So I think if you got, you know, like a probe and looked into the soil, there'd be all these pores, corridors, bits of organic matter, gradients of water, gradients of moisture. And really that sort of heterogeneity allows all those organisms to coexist and survive.
Cool.
Oh, that's fascinating. I mean, we talk a lot to people who are involved in assessing the state of the soils across the country. I've heard it said recently that there's no specific evidence about whether soil biodiversity at that sort of countrywide level is increasing or decreasing. What's your view?
Well, I think, I mean, again, the bottom line is we don't really know because there is no systematic monitoring of soil biodiversity in the UK. We do have surveys which give a certain amount of information, like the Countryside Survey, for example. But fundamentally, we simply don't know because we don't have the resolution of data. I think the other thing is that diversity in the soil is probably going up potentially in some places. I mean, we're less nitrogen deposition, less sulfur deposition. All these things will put pressure on diversity within the soils. And they've been, those pressures have been relaxed. And also there's land use changes, habitat recreation and things which we might come on to later. But I think overall, I mean, the bottom line is when you look at data about how land use intensification, land use change, particularly conversion of natural or semi-natural habitats to agriculture and more intensive agricultural practices, they almost certainly lead to declines in the diversity of organisms, most organisms within the soil. And, you know, if you look at the figures for the UK, England and Wales, 4 million hectares of soil at risk of compaction, 2 million at risk of erosion. You know, soils are degraded in many parts, and with that degradation will come declines in biodiversity. So I guess if you think of a country, I would say there are probably hotspots areas, particularly intensive agriculture or urbanization, where there will be declines. But in other areas, it's probably stable or potentially increasing.
Yeah, brilliant. So you mentioned that there's levels of degradation, you know, through erosion and compaction and things, but you mentioned there are also ecosystems that are being restored and converted. So overall, what would you say the status of soil biodiversity in the UK was? And looking forward to the fact that we got these 30-30 targets for biodiversity, you know, restoring 30% of habitats by 30% by 2030. What does that mean for soil biodiversity?
Yeah, I think in general, I think given the scale of degradation of soils through physical degradation, chemical degradation, I would say that in general, soil biodiversity will be negatively affected by that on a national scale. But as you say, we have these changes in land use and these different commitments, 30-30 being one, as you say, 30% of land to be protected for wildlife habitats and recreation. And I mean, it's difficult. It doesn't always go hand in hand that higher diversity above ground means higher diversity below ground. But in general, restoration of habitats and higher quality habitats through better maintenance of sites of special scientific interest or recreation of degraded land. I can't see how that can't be beneficial for biodiversity within the soil. So there are many different schemes now, as you say, you know, landscape recovery, environmental land management schemes in agriculture, that in general you would expect will benefit the soil physical and chemical environment, and in turn that should benefit the organisms in the soil. Just to add to that as well is, you know, the organisms in the soil also play a role in the actual recreation of those habitats themselves. You know, and it's maybe a topic we'll come on to later, but soil organisms are central to actually establishing or enhancing restoration and allowing plant species, for example, to coexist. So it's also important that the organisms have a feedback effect in restoration, in facilitating the benefits of those restoration processes. I mean, I think it is generally, you know, soil biodiversity is pretty much ignored, I would say, in all these different conventions, international and national conventions. So, you know, biodiversity gain, net gain, for example, is really about above ground species, birds, moths, invertebrates, some plants, but it really does ignore this vast diversity of organisms found in the soil.
Yeah, so there's some good news stories there about some schemes, various schemes that are going to help improve things. What do you think of the remaining threats? You know, there's still some land that's fairly intensively managed. So what are those threats that are still to biodiversity? Do biocides like herbicides and pesticides play a role, or can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, I would say that the number one threat to soil biodiversity, I mean, firstly, globally, I would say it's conversion of natural habitats to agriculture. Without a doubt. We just did a big synthesis of data on deforestation of natural forests to croplands, grasslands, and it's the number one cause, I would say, of changes or declines in diversity. I should say that not all groups of organisms are negatively affected. Bacterial diversity tends to be or can be higher in more intensively managed systems, and not everything changes in the same way. But I think intensive agriculture is probably one of the biggest issues. Continuous cultivation, heavy use of fertilizers, for example. I mean, essentially fertilizers bypass the need for plants to invest in things like mycorrhizal fungi. They have smaller root systems, so they don't invest carbon into the soil, which is the main fuel for these organisms. And generally it's associated with less organic matter, which is again a key resource for these organisms. So really sort of intensive agriculture, urbanization, soil sealing is a big issue. Pollution is a key issue, but that's probably more localized in particular areas. Yeah. But generally, you know, intensive practices tend to make soil food webs simpler, less complex, and more homogenized. You know, essentially it's like biotic homogenization of the communities in the soil. Yeah,
sure. Good. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I was wondering as well about climate extremes. You know, do they impact soil organisms and their function? And then on the sort of the other side of that coin, if you like, should we be bearing in mind the role of soil biodiversity in climate? Is there a role? You know, how do these things work together? Presumably, nature does work together. So what's your view about that?
Yeah, I mean, climate extremes, as you say, droughts, heat waves, floods, for example, are going to become more intense and more frequent. They already are. And there is now quite a large body of evidence, including our own work. That's one of our primary focuses, looking at drought impacts, climate extremes. They almost certainly have a strong impact on the diversity and composition of communities, and also the functions that they perform. In most cases, those communities recover. So, you know, your general droughts and things like that, you know, I mean, soil communities are very diverse, which makes them able to sort of bounce back from a lot of these extreme events. But I think the concern is more as they become more frequent and intense, they may be legacy effects in terms of them not bouncing back. And I guess the problem at the moment is we don't really know or understand what those legacy effects would be. We did some studies recently where we took soils and hit them repeatedly with extreme dry wet cycles, in laboratory conditions, so it doesn't necessarily reflect what goes on in the real world. But what we did find is it shifted the community to a different condition in that it didn't recover back to its previous state. And that condition was functionally, at least in terms of carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus cycling, more depauperate, if you like. So in those studies, it does suggest that if you really hit soils repeatedly, their capacity to bounce back is impaired. And, you know, in the future, when we get more intense, frequent droughts, there could be sort of similar impacts on the diversity of life in the soil.
Yeah. So a question then, right? So we're saying that soil biodiversity is important, but is there any experimental evidence of, you know, links between soil biodiversity and function? You know, that's the thing that we're really worried about, right? The function of the soils. Yeah. Is there any evidence that changing soil biodiversity affects functions in the soil?
Yeah, I mean, there is experimental evidence. It always comes with caveats. So I would say one of the problems in testing for changes in diversity and how that affects processes is that in natural situations, the soil environment itself will also change. So if you have soil degradation causing loss of diversity, there's also a change in the physical chemical properties of the soil. So it's quite hard to disentangle. But having said that, lots of experiments have been done. And there is, you know, there's evidence showing that just simply across large areas, for example, of land, where you get high diversity tends to be associated with higher functioning of the soil, nutrient cycling, carbon cycling, etc. And similarly, lower diversity areas tend to be associated with lower functions. And experimental studies do provide some evidence. But I think, I mean, in my mind, what the important thing is that certain organisms do things differently to others. And in the soil, there are keystone species that perform particular functions. There are engineers like earthworms that sort of have a disproportionate effect. So fundamentally, it depends on which species are lost from the communities. And I think there's quite a lot of evidence showing that the responses are really quite specific to the species that are lost and also the soil conditions in which they're actually in. But I think, I mean, having worked in the area for 30 odd years or more or whatever, I would say, you know, if you simplify a food web in the soil, make it more less diverse, less interactions within that food web, the impact ultimately is not going to be good.
Yeah, right. That's a great way of summarizing it. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, are there specific areas of where we can expect to see higher levels of soil biodiversity? I mean, can people think in a more targeted way about, you know, where we ought to be focusing efforts either to restore or to preserve? And you know, the kind of covenant mindset where we think, well, actually, this is where there's a massive resource of something special, and we need to put things in place to protect it.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you're thinking about the UK and also globally, I think, you know, natural, semi-natural habitats will generally be the hotspots of biodiversity, woodlands, species-rich grasslands. I mean, we don't have many natural, or hardly any natural habitats left in England, at least. And, you know, those ones where you're going to have the intact communities, which have strong interactions with plants, with each other, etc. So that's really going to be the sort of hotspots, these more extensively managed systems. And the kind of sort of wildlife rich habitats, that's the kind of initiatives we were talking about before. They're the kind of places where soil biodiversity in general is likely to be in a better state than it is in the more degraded habitats that they started from. I mean, the places for targeting, I would have thought is, you know, more intensively managed agricultural systems, you know, because that's, we'll come onto this later, I suspect, but that's really where there are also co-benefits in terms of the actual sustainable agriculture, for example. So, you know, you're benefiting the diversity of the soil, which in turn is bringing potential benefits for crops, but also for wider ecosystem services. So I think it's really targeting those soils that are degraded. And as I said before, biodiversity plays a role in, they work together, basically. You know, it helps restore those systems and also benefits the diversity at the same time. So that's really where I would sort of think the biggest gains are, you know, heavily cultivated arable land, intensively managed grasslands, that kind of thing. I should say, I mean, one thing that's quite interesting is how the land has been managed historically has quite a strong impact on what happens when you change land management. So, for example, we just did a study in hill grasslands across the United Kingdom, across a wide range of sites, which have been traditionally grazed by sheep for centuries, very, very low levels of grazing. But the removal of grazing consistently led to declines in the diversity of soil animals and microbes across all different functional groups. So in that case, you know, a change in grazing management, which has been going on for centuries literally, had quite a strong negative effect on the diversity of life in soil. So we need to take account of how the land has been managed previously, and it doesn't necessarily follow that interventions that might be considered good for above ground diversity will have similar effects below ground.
Do you have a kind of sense of timeframes within that? I mean, we often hear that soils degrade quite quickly but improve slowly. You know, what can people expect when they're looking to kind of look at restorative type projects?
Yeah, I think again, it depends on the historic management of the sites. And I'll just give you a couple of examples. One would be, we've done some work on ex-arable land, which has been heavily cultivated. And we've looked at planting different plant species mixtures with a view to sort of promoting the diversity of organisms in the soil. And we saw responses within 3 years. So if they're, you know, if they're heavily hammered, I think you can see benefits relatively quickly for the functioning of soils. I mean, it'll always take time to build carbon in the soils and nutrients, but I think you can start to see a trajectory of recovery relatively quickly. Whereas if you go to you know, some grassland sites, for example, again, we've done some biodiversity restoration experiments in Yorkshire, in the Yorkshire Dales, and these are sort of, they've not been managed that intensively. They've got relatively high carbon contents, but we changed the management regimes and it took nearly 14 years before we saw anything. So, you know, it really depends on the pre-existing conditions. I think in soils that are really degraded, I think you can see relatively rapid responses in terms of the right trajectory. It might take time after that and things might slow down, but I think you can generally accelerate restoration processes relatively quickly.
Brilliant.
Yeah. Changing tack a bit, Richard. I saw in the news a couple of days ago, the Soil Association, I think, were encouraging people to do a worm dance to bring up worms and then report the number of worms that were there, which I think is a great way of engaging people, you know, in looking down rather than looking up in the worms and the biodiversity that's under their feet. Is it just good for public engagement, or do you think there could be anything useful for science that comes out of this?
Well, I think there could be. I mean, if they're done well, I think there could be real benefits. I mean, we talked earlier about monitoring schemes, you know, just the general lack of information that we have at sort of close spatial scales on the organisms in the soil. So in that sense, you could get some pretty strong data. I mean, if you just look at voluntary information for birds, invertebrates, bats, you know, a lot of the information comes from voluntary schemes in terms of people.
Science.
Citizen science. So I think there could be real benefits. And I think, as you say, I mean, just simply getting people looking at soils and looking at what's in there, particularly young people, I think, is absolutely crucial to raising awareness about the importance of that diversity in soils. So I think it can be beneficial. You know, it has to be done well. You know, and I mean, there are uncertainties in some of the information you'll get, how you extract them, for example, when you extract them. But overall, I think it's a very good thing and should be encouraged. I mean, one thing we often do is outreach events, and you know, you can have kit measuring gases coming out of the soil or nutrients, all this kit, and then you can have a bucket of soil with some worms in or something else in, and the school kids, bam, they're in that bucket with their hands pulling out the worms. You know, that's what they gets them excited. You know, not always sophisticated kit. It's actually looking at the organisms and seeing what's actually living in the soil. So to me, I think it's a really, really good thing.
Excellent, thank you.
I mean, when you're thinking about that sort of quality of information, do factors, and you were talking earlier about pre-existing conditions, do factors such as a soil type play a big role in what you'd want to see where in terms of soil biodiversity?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, soil type is probably one of the main, if you look on a global scale, the big factors that determine diversity of life in soil is soil type, its texture, it's like the pH of the soil. They're predominant factors along with climate, vegetation, etc. And even at a local scale, a lot of different management interventions for agriculture or restoration, they really depend on the type of soil, and what that will determine whether they're successful. So it's really important to tailor interventions to the actual types of soils, because it's the physical environment that it's like houses that we live in. Effectively, it's the the physical structures that the organisms live in and the plants live in, which plays a key role in shaping those communities and what they actually do. So soil type is really key to a lot of the interventions for biodiversity. And I was going to say that brings challenges, because those kind of relationships are things that we don't really understand, and that's an area I think that needs to be improved knowledge really in understanding how you tailor management to meet the actual soil conditions that you actually have.
Certainly, yeah. Well, I mean, soil organisms are clearly critical to maintaining soil health. How would you think about kind of harnessing soil biodiversity knowledge for sustainable agriculture, which is gaining traction as a kind of concept, but is quite loose as well in terms of what people are expecting to see from it and what it actually means in itself?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing is, soil biodiversity or organisms is just one part of soil health. As I've been stressing, it's also the physical and chemical aspects, so you need to look at the role of organisms in a holistic way. And, again, that relates to what we were just saying. It's really, just managing for soil biodiversity is not going to solve the world's problems. We need to look at soils in a very holistic way. But I think, generally, I'd say there are sort of three areas where there's potential to really benefit the soil generally, and also to harness the benefits of biodiversity. I think tillage is a key one. There's a lot of interest in no-till, reduced till, which has clear benefits for lots of organisms within the soil. There are also potential side effects like nitrous oxide emissions, and sometimes you have to use more herbicides, for example. But generally, no-till agriculture has benefits for the organisms in the soil. I think the other area, which is, I think, particularly exciting, is crop management. And this comes in different ways. One is just traditional practices, intercropping, that it relies often on interactions between roots and organisms in the soil. For example, phosphorus mineralizing, bugs around root zones. People have done this for centuries, but we're starting to understand the science behind it in terms of the organisms involved and how one plant might facilitate or benefit the growth of another. And things like crop rotations and diversification of crops in those rotations. I think knowledge is starting to grow. But I think a really sort of exciting area, I think, is crop breeding. Because, crop breeding has always been based on what goes on above ground, i.e. grain, and responses to nitrogen, for example, with very little consideration of the actual roots of the plants, i.e. the below ground traits. And it's those roots that can interact with the organisms and potentially bring benefits for crop growth, disease prevention, water use relationships, through sort of harnessing the benefits of organisms in the soil. And to me, that's a really exciting area, sort of linking what we know about crop breeding and crop physiology to what goes on in the actual root zone of the plants. So there's sort of two key areas. I mean, other areas are things like amendments, composting, waste management, and things like that, which I think is also key for benefiting organisms within the soil.
Yeah. So you mentioned earlier that soils are the real big player in terms of biodiversity, but you also mentioned that a lot of these biodiversity improvement schemes or restoration schemes don't really consider soils very much.
Yeah.
Given that a lot of developers and farmers are looking for net biodiversity gain, what's the role of soils or soil biodiversity in that?
Well, I think it could potentially be pretty enormous, really, in terms of biodiversity. If you were to quantify the biodiversity gains below ground, it could be a major contribution. But the bottom line is it's not generally, if at all, considered within those actual targets. I think most biodiversity gains probably linked to habitats and particular species groups, but probably for good reason, because it's difficult to actually monitor these things. But I think soils are an integral part of restoring habitats, and the organisms within them play a key role. And if methods develop to become high throughput enough to be able to enumerate diversity, it could play a key role. I mean, so note that the convention on the last convention of biological diversity did recognise soil biodiversity and the need to manage diversity. So I think things are sort of starting, and there are global schemes to monitor soil biodiversity, national schemes. So I think things are moving in that direction, but ultimately it's a very costly and time-consuming thing to do.
Yeah.
So as technology develops, it could become a key element of biodiversity gain. And I would argue as a soil biodiversity that it should, because most species are below ground.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, we don't want to burden farmers with having to do all these expensive measurements, but I think, the case is made. I think you just made the case very clearly. We should at least be trying to do that. We should be including this below ground biodiversity, because we're maybe overlooking it at the expense of above ground biodiversity.
Yeah, and there could be proxies, for below ground diversity that people are exploring. There could be indicators, when we talked about earthworms, that key groups that are, nothing in soil is easy to measure, but they're relatively easy to look at. And I think the other exciting thing is a lot of these methods are really developing fast, molecular tools, and wouldn't surprise me if before long, 10 years, you can go with a small probe and put it in the soil and get a measure of the diversity of what's in there.
That'd be cool, wouldn't it?
That would be fantastic. We do need, it's not, I guess we need to go beyond just saying what's there. We also need to know what they're doing. But I think it would move, that would be a really exciting step in the right direction.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, we talked quite a bit about the need for this kind of more holistic view, and why that's critical always when we're considering nature, and some of the trade-offs we might be thinking about in terms of chemical use and things like that within agriculture. So it'd be interesting to hear your view on how the key interrelations, if you like, or co-benefits around biodiversity in other areas of the soil that people potentially understand a bit more, such as carbon, and whether there are, what the relationship is between soil biodiversity, soil carbon, how one affects the other in different soils, and any ideas around sort of proxies, if they're clear proxies that people can think about when they're thinking about soil biodiversity, if it feels a little bit out of sight.
Yeah, I mean, soil organisms obviously play a key role in soil carbon cycling, and different organisms do different things. Some of them break the carbon down, some of them stabilize that carbon, some of them release the carbon back to the atmosphere. So soil organisms are, absolutely integral to the cycling of carbon, both its decomposition and also its stabilization in soil. And conversely, organisms depend on organic matter to survive. So inputs of organic matter into soil from plants or manures or composts, again, play a key role in maintaining those communities and fueling them, if you like, with resources for them to be able to survive. But it's an area that's really very fast developing in terms of microbial, in particular, contributions to carbon cycling. Just in the last few years, there's two areas I would say that's really become sort of really fast-moving areas, which are maybe not so much proxies, but they just demonstrate in a more general way the contribution that organisms can play. And one of them is necromass. So necromass is dead organic matter, basically. It's dead microbes. So microbes grow, they die, and they produce metabolites. And when they die, the carbon is often bound with minerals in the soil, and become stabilized in these mineral associated pools, which are more stable than the more labile particulate carbon that comes directly from a plant. And it's been shown in some studies that this necromass, or dead microbial material, can constitute almost half of the total organic carbon pool, and it's predominantly fungi that contribute to that pool. So this is I've just been writing some literature on different aspects of organisms and contributions to sustainable agriculture, and this is an area that's really booming now. I mean, most of the work's been done within the last 4 or 5 years or something, and there's new papers coming out all the time. But it's really sort of pointing to the importance of microbial turnover in particular as a real driver of carbon sequestration, but also the stabilization of carbon in the soil. So, the more we understand that, the more we may be able to manage soils in a way which actually encourage those processes of necromass formation and hence the stabilization of carbon within the soil. So, it's a sort of fast developing area. I think it's very hard to link diversity per se to these processes, because there's so many different organisms doing so many different things, and it's almost futile to me, really, because it's probably key groups of organisms that are driving particular functions, and it's really understanding them, I think, which is the key thing to understanding how these organisms contribute to sequestration of carbon in soils.
I mean, when you think about those key groups, if you were, if you had, the budget that you wanted to give to nations to say, monitor this and this and this in your soil, what would you have? Would you have your shopping list in your mind that were the obvious ones?
Yeah, I think I don't want to upset my colleagues working on bacteria, but I think fungi are pretty key, really. Particularly in these more extensive or natural systems, fungi play a key role. They associate with plant roots. They're major decomposers of organic matter, and as I said before, they contribute significantly to the formation of necromass. And they're generally or often ignored, in inventories, etc., for monitoring diversity. So I think fungi I would certainly have as a key measure of organisms in the soil, and perhaps some of the animals. I mean, again, if you look at the knowledge on soil biodiversity across the world, one, it's very patchy, so there are big geographical blind spots, but also most of the information is on bacteria, then probably fungi, and then there's all these animals which are pretty much, we don't really know much at all about their distribution. So I think some of those animals could be key to monitoring as well in those kind of measures, because they really drive the processes that operate in the soil. A lot of meat microbes and excrete nutrients into the environment, which is how plants access those nutrients. So things like nematodes, for example, I think would be a good target for future work.
And when you're thinking about that, are you thinking about certain parts of the soil profile, or should we always be thinking about the topsoil? Or that's a difficult question.
I was going to say before, when you asked about difficulties in quantifying diversity, etc., pretty much all we know is about the surface soil, because that's where most organisms live, because that's where most organic matter is and most roots are. But even so, we rarely go down deep into the soil profile. And, there's a lot of emphasis now on subsurface processes, particularly things like carbon storage and cycling, but we don't really know much about what goes on in the subsoil. I mean, I think the reason for that is because it's difficult. And if you're doing surveys on diversity or sampling experiments, you have to make decisions about the number of samples you can take, for example, and often a trade-off of that is going down deep into the soil. So it's pretty unexplored, I would say, relative to the topsoil.
They're an unexplored part of the unexplored part of the soil.
Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely. Great.
We need to go deeper.
Yeah, go deeper. It's like outer space.
Yeah.
Definitely. Great.
But there'll be some pretty weird things going on in those subsoils. It'd be more anaerobic, it's colder, less roots, potentially less organic matter. It's an interesting environment to explore.
So there's a lot of buzz and chatter around potentially using soil inoculants, that this is putting organisms that are perceived to be beneficial to plants or production. They're increasingly being used in agriculture and in restoration projects. What's the impact of that going to be on the native soil biodiversity? Is it going to be working with it, or is it going to be swamping it? You know, what's your overall opinion on soil inoculants?
Well, I think inoculants, I mean, I think the available, I don't work on inoculants, but from my understanding, the available evidence would suggest that their responses are highly variable. So, you know, there are some situations where they can benefit crop yields, for example, inoculants of seeds with mycorrhizal fungi, etc. But they're very variable, depending on crop type, soil type, as we talked about before. And I think the other worry is how they impact the native soil communities, because there have been studies done showing that in most cases, or often, they will have impacts on the native organisms. Now, what that actually means in terms of the functioning of the soil, we don't know, but all the same, they do seem to have impacts on the organisms of the soil. I mean, in my own view on it is, you know, I sort of think, why not just change the environment of the soil to improve that environment to actually benefit the organisms that are actually already there? And I often wonder, you know, if you add a specific bug to soil, it's a really harsh environment, but you know, the chances of it surviving are probably quite low unless it's really intimately linked to the plant, for example, as a seed dressing or something like that. So my view would be really on, you know, promoting the beneficial microbes and their functioning rather than trying to introduce new species. I mean, the only caveat to that would be potentially in restoration, ecosystem restoration of really degraded soils or habitats. And there is growing evidence that transplanting soils from sort of nearby pristine habitats, for example, to those sites can actually accelerate restoration of those habitats and make them more similar to the target communities.
So you're like giving it a kickstart.
Yeah, basically, yeah. And it really, yeah, it's I don't think just adding the soil or the inoculant is going to do it. You'd also need other interventions alongside. So I think in that case, it could work by using wild microbiomes, if you like. But I think in agriculture, I guess unless it was really controlled agriculture, you know, horticulture, for example, to me, it's better to harness what's actually there.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, good.
I was going to ask about regenerative agriculture, because I mean, you could almost say it's on a trajectory to something that looks a little bit like mainstream. There's definitely, you know, a lot of energy around it.
Yeah.
You know, for you, what do we need to know about soil biodiversity when we're thinking about regenerative agriculture? I guess, what would you want to communicate to people about what the easy wins are? Mm-hmm. And then it would be interesting to hear a little bit more about the, you know, what are the trade-offs in terms of soil biodiversity when we're thinking about things like tillage versus glyphosate use, which might potentially, I guess, be on the increase if that is one of the main tools to make regen agriculture kind of, you know, cover a vaster land mass.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a general comment. I think, I mean, regenerative agriculture is quite vague as a concept. You know, we don't, you know, there's lots of different definitions out there, and there's a lot of uncertainty about what constitutes regenerative agriculture or not. But on the whole, I'd say, I mean, my view, it's a good thing. Anything that gets people thinking about soil and how they manage soil can't be a bad thing. So in that sense, I think it's really good. I think the biggest wins, probably the kind of things we were talking about before, reduced tillage, for example. I mean, an obvious trade-off you mentioned is increased herbicide use and potential greenhouse gas emissions, nitrous oxide, for example. But I think really the sort of exciting area is trying to integrate diversity into a farm scale system. I mean, my sort of general view is that any measures to diversify cropping systems, farming systems can only generally be a good thing for the soil. I mean, it's a gross generalization, but even so, I think that can bring benefits for the diversity of soils. And, you know, healthy soils, it's like a feedback, really. You know, you don't just farm for the healthy soils will bring resilience, disease suppression, and all these additional benefits. I think there's also a lot of potential benefits of integrating livestock and some of these other measures, for example, cropping systems and livestock systems. I mean, these are all things that people have done for centuries, you know, so it's not rocket science, a lot of it. But I guess where we really need the scientific knowledge is to sort of really pinpoint some of these different measures that, you know, there's a lot of hearsay in terms of how certain types of management or grazing management can benefit. I mean, I guess we need the evidence really to support those different measures, and that's what's needed, I think, for policy, is really to get that evidence to really say definitively that this works best here for diversity, whereas it might not work here. So again, it goes back to tailoring the management for different situations.
Yeah, yeah, and would you? I mean, within that, maybe people are going to be thinking about yield, farmers, and profitability. Is there anything that you've come across, or any work you've ever done that examines that link between soil biodiversity and yield and resilience? I guess goes in that basket as well, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I suspect a lot of these interventions will have yield costs, at least in the short term. But one thing, I mean, we do some work on restoration of grasslands and species diversity in grasslands. So we have some long-term experiments that have been ongoing for several years, you know, up to 25, 30 years now. And we clearly see, you know, that the treatments that are best for biodiversity, whether plant or soil, tend to be those which are associated with declines in hay yield. I mean, it just goes without saying, there's less nutrients in the system, recycling, so you're going to have a suppression. But what we do find is over time, the yields are more stable. So, you know, even though you might have a suppression in yield, the yields actually are more stable over time. So they're more able to buffer variation in climate, etc. And we also find that the more interventions that you use, so you combine different interventions like fertilizer, seed addition, etc., manure addition, generally the benefits for a wider range of ecosystem services are more apparent. So it's, you know, again, it's combining different management interventions and understanding how they affect a wide range of ecosystem services rather than just focusing singly on yield.
And when you're thinking about that yield stability over time, what sort of timeframes do you have in your mind that, you know, somebody going into that or thinking, well, you know, this is an investment, what's the length of their investment period?
Yeah, I mean, in our situation, you're talking sort of decades, really. You know, yield stability over decades. So, you know, you'd be talking over a longer term. In terms of reaping those benefits, it probably does take some time before, you know, the communities become established, etc., to be able to confer that stability to extreme weather events. So it's really, I guess these are all sort of longer term benefits that are going to come from practicing things over years, you know, potentially decades.
Richard, we're going to finish by bringing you back to your day job for the final question.
Okay.
You're at the cutting edge of soil biodiversity research. You're a global leader in it. What are the big frontiers? Are there any new technologies emerging like eDNA, metabolomics, or something? Are those the big frontiers, or are there some big conceptual frontiers that really excite you, that really get you up in the morning?
Yeah, I mean, I think I think generally a sort of, it's a bit of a boring frontier, but, you know, fundamentally we do need more information on spatial temporal variability in soil communities, and, you know, how they vary from place to place, and that is I'd say a pretty important development. Related to that is there's new technology, as you said, eDNA, different sequencing approaches, and, you know, just over my career, I remember first time we ever used molecular tools, we could analyze 2 or 3 samples. Now, wow, you know, it's just growing and growing. The technology is getting faster, more efficient all the time. So, you know, that's really allowing us to look at the composition of communities, but also what they do. So things like metagenomics, you know, you can actually link changes in communities to actual functions and things like their ability to withstand droughts, etc. So, you know, the technology is developing to be able to really sort of interrogate the organisms within the soil. I mean, I think a really exciting area, and this is an area that we're sort of looking at as well, is roots. You know, as I said before, plant ecologists have generally looked at what goes on above ground.
Yeah.
Soil ecologists have generally ignored plants, or they did historically. Now, you know, it's the roots that connect what goes on above ground to the soil, and there's growing sort of understanding of root characteristics, how different root systems can impact different organisms, and how that has implications for things like carbon storage, nitrogen cycling, etc. So, you know, really sort of understanding that root microbiome, if you like, and how it responds to environmental variation, etc., I think is a really exciting area of research. And linked to that is the capacity to actually interrogate complex data, because these methods yield vast amounts of data. So all these things like machine learning, etc., you know, artificial intelligence, I think really offer potential to sort of really interrogate these complex communities that occur in the soil and relate that to what the organisms do.
So there's still a job for us to do then.
I think there's, yeah, I think so. I mean, I always find it quite interesting when people say it's quite common that people say we know nothing about what happens in the soil, or very little. I mean, we do know a hell of a lot, actually. You know, there's libraries are stacked full of journals and papers and books. You know, we've all done lots of work on these things over many, many years as of other people. And, you know, I'd say we know a hell of a lot, but I think there's a lot more
to know. Yeah.
We got a few years yet.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you for talking to us today, Richard. That's been fantastic. Is there anything that we didn't ask that you wanted to say?
No, I can't think of anything really. I mean, I think I just think a key thing is to look at diversity in soils in a sort of holistic way in terms of, you know, the physical and chemical environments and all the organisms and their interactions. So looking at them as a food web is how personally I would look at diversity, rather than just numbers of species that you find in the soil.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Richard. It's been fascinating.